If you're interested in Bible prophecy, you'll want to watch this video because I'm going to show the biblical proof that the sign of the Son of Man and the gathering of the elect may actually happen in the fall of 2015. I'm not saying it will happen, but I'm going to show that it really is possible for the reasons listed here. In this video, we're going to focus on the fig tree riddle first because one of the possible endings of the final generation is the fall of 2015. In Matthew 24, Jesus told us to watch for the fig tree to sprout forth leaves in the springtime. The book of Hosea tells us the fathers of Israel are the first ripe in the fig tree, and the country of Israel was officially established in the spring of 1948. So Jesus was telling us when Israel sprouts forth leaves in the springtime, one generation will not pass before everything in verses 1 through 31 will come to pass. In a previous video, we examined everything in verses 1 through 31 and found that the only thing left to occur is the sign of the Son of Man in heaven appearing, the falling of the stars, and the gathering of the elect. This presents three possibilities. Number one, this may mean the stars will fall and the elect will be rescued within one generation after the spring of 1948. And if that's true, then the question is, how long is one generation exactly? The second possibility is that Jesus' riddle of the fig tree does not refer to the foundation of Israel in the spring of 1948. And the third possibility is that this prophecy in Matthew 24 is false. Because we've already seen the truth of many of these prophecies, number 3 is not likely at this point. So the most likely options are either 1 or 2. Either the falling stars and gathering of the elect will occur within one generation after the spring of 1948, or the spring of 1948 was not the budding of the fig tree. In this video, we're going to focus on option number 1. The first thing we know is the word generation in the Bible generally refers to each successive group of children within a lineage. For example, in Exodus 20 verse 5, it says Yahweh will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children until the 3rd and 4th generation. In other words, if a man does iniquity, his children will be punished for it. And not just his children, but his grandchildren, his grandchildren's children, and his grandchildren's grandchildren will be punished for whatever he did. Among other things, this shows that the word generation can refer to each successive group of children born within any given lineage. Therefore, in Matthew 24, when Jesus says, "This generation will not pass," he's referring to the lifetime of one generation or group of children. So the question is, how long is the lifetime of the generation that he refers to? In the case that we're looking at here, the generation would represent those who were born in the spring of 1948. Those children, he would indicate, would not pass before the meteorite and rescue occur. He doesn't say that every single person in that generation will not pass, but that the basic generation will not pass. In other words, the meteorite apocalypse and rescue, gathering of the elect, will occur before all of the children of that generation die. The longest age anyone has ever been documented to live is 123 years. That means the generation born in 1948 will most likely be completely passed on by 2071. So Jesus may be telling us that the meteorite and rescue will occur before 2071 at the absolute maximum. The other possibility for the length of the generation in Matthew 24 is in Psalm 90, which says in verse 10, "The days of our years are 70, which is 70, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, which is 80. Since the generations are mentioned in verse 1, this may be an indication that one generation is 70 to 80 years. So the second possibility is that the meteorite and rescue will occur either before 2018 or before 2028. But there's still a third and earlier possibility. The book of Matthew itself gives us 3 time periods and tells us each represents 14 generations. We looked at this in a previous video and we'll go over it again in a minute. But first, let's understand why this is important. The first is a period of 941 years, and I know some people disagree with that. And please continue watching because I'm going to prove to you that it really is 941. So the first is a period of 941 years. We're just going to look at why this is important. The second is 454 years, and the third is 600 years. When we divide these time periods by 14 generations, we end up with 4 possible lengths of one generation: 67.21 years, 32.42 years, or 42.85 years. If we add all the time periods together and divide that by a total of 14 times 3, or 42 generations, we end up with 47.5 years in one generation. When we add each length of one generation generation to the budding of the fig tree Israel in 1948, the end reaches the years 2015, 1980, 1990, or 1995. This means that we are literally right now in 2015 in the final year that can represent the end of one generation in the book of Matthew itself. If the fig tree sprouted forth leaves in 1948, we can calculate the 67.21 years down to the exact date and maybe even to the exact hour, but Jesus specifically told us not to do that right after he told us the riddle. Therefore, we're not given the information necessary to know the day or the hour of the event in question, but we may have the clues necessary to find the week, month, or season. If we count the weeks and months from the spring of 1948 when Israel sprouted forth leaves, the end of the generation would have occurred in mid-September 2015, because that is the 0.21 from the end of the 67th year at the end of spring in 2015. But here's the clincher. Jesus didn't tell us to count the weeks and months. And although he didn't specifically say not to count the weeks and months, he did say in Luke 1 verse 20, "My words shall be fulfilled in their season." So Jesus instructed us specifically not to count the days or the hours. He said the prophecy will be fulfilled in a certain season. Well, mid-September is always the beginning of the fall season. And September 2015 specifically was the beginning of the fall season at the end of the maximum length of one generation in the book of Matthew. That means we may be in due season right now. But let's look closer at this time period between Abraham and David, because I really want people to understand that this first time period in Matthew 1 really is equal to 941 years. Some people will look at this chart and immediately say, no, the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years and turn off the video and that's the end of it. So I want to go over this again and show what the scriptures actually say when we consider all the variables in context. First of all, I think most scholars will agree that this much of the timeline is correct. Everything you see here is clear in Scripture. Abraham left when he was 75 years old. He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. And Jacob entered Egypt when he was 130 years old. The next very clear point in the timeline tells us Moses was 80 years old when the Israelites left Egypt, and there were 480 years from the time they left Egypt until Solomon's 4th year, and we know Solomon became king 40 years after David was made king. So everything here is plain as day in Scripture. There shouldn't be any debate over these time periods because they're clearly stated in the text. It does take a little more work to find the years between Jacob's entry into Egypt and Joseph's death, but once we understand that Jacob entered Egypt in the 2nd year of the famine lasted 7 years and was preceded by 7 years of plenty, and Joseph was 30 years old at the start of the 7 years of plenty, then we understand that Joseph was 39 years old in the year that Jacob entered Egypt. And again, as far as I know, there is no debate about this timeline up to this point. It's only the time period between Joseph's death and Moses' birth that is disagreed upon. The problem starts with Exodus 12. Verses 40 and 41 seem to indicate at first glance that the Israelites were physically living in Egypt for 430 years. Okay, so let's work with this for a moment to see what happens. If the Israelites were physically living in Egypt for 430 years, then the total number of years from Abraham to David would be 1,156 years. That would mean that the length of one generation in Matthew 1 would be found by dividing 1156 by 14, and that would give us a maximum length of one generation in the book of Matthew at 82.57 years. And that would mean the end of the one generation from the budding of the fig tree, if it's Israel in 1948, would not occur until the year 2030. But please allow me to show you that that is not what the Bible says, and the Bible itself actually proves that is wrong. So let's look specifically at the time period the Israelites were in Egypt. We know Jacob entered Egypt when he was 130 years old. That's pretty clear. We are also told very clearly that Moses was 80 years old when the Israelites left Egypt. So all we need to do is find out how many years passed between the year the Israelites entered Egypt until Moses' birth. And the answer starts in Genesis 46, where we're given the exact names of every single descendant of Jacob who entered Egypt with him when he was 130 years old. Not only are we given the exact names of each of of these descendants, but these descendants are also numbered. So there's no mistake about who came into Egypt with Jacob when he was 130 years old. So first of all, the Israelites were the descendants of Jacob. In verse 2, God speaks to Israel and says, Jacob, Jacob. So that's the first point. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So Israel, in this case, literally refers to Jacob, and the Israelites refer to Jacob's descendants. Then verses 5 through 7 say, And Jacob rose up, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father and their little ones and their wives in the wagons and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him. Then verse 8 says, And these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Then it lists all the descendants, starting with Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and his sons. So if you count all of Jacob's children and their children from verses 8 through 24, you'll see there were a total of 70 descendants. It confirms that in verses 26 and 27. All the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, that came out of his loins, besides Jacob's wives, including the sons of Joseph, which were born in Egypt, which were 2 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. In other words, 70. So Jacob entered Egypt when he was 130 years old, and he brought 70 of his children and grandchildren with him at that time. Okay, now notice in verse 11 that one of Jacob's grandchildren who came into Egypt with him was Levi's son Kohath. And some people think this is a mistake, that Kohath wasn't born yet. He's just listed here because he was a descendant later, but that's not correct. This chapter is very clear that these are the descendants who came into Egypt with Jacob. They're not only listed by name, but they are numbered. There were 70 descendants who came into Egypt with Jacob, and Kohath is listed as the 15th of those 70 descendants. And that's very interesting. Take note of that right there. Kohath is the key to this whole thing, this whole timeline, the generation, the length of the generation and everything. And he was specifically the 15th of Jacob's descendants who entered Egypt with Jacob, the 15th of the total 70. Think about that. So Jacob was 130 years old when he entered Egypt, and he came in with Levi and his son Kohath. This is a very key point right here, because Kohath was Moses' grandfather. In Exodus 6, verses 16 through 20, we're given the genealogy from Levi to Moses. Levi had a son named Kohath. Kohath had a son named Amram, and Amram was Moses' father. So now it's clear from the time Jacob entered Egypt with Kohath until Kohath's grandchild Moses left, there was only one full generation completed from beginning to end. That was the generation of Amram. We're also given the exact number of years that Kohath and Amram lived. In verse 18, it says the years of the life of Kohath were 133 years. So we're told that Kohath lived for a total of 133 years. We're not told how old Kohath was when Jacob entered Egypt. So to be fair, we're going to look at the maximum number of years that is possible given what we're told. We're also given the exact number of years that Amram lived in Exodus 6, verse 20. The years of the life of Amram were 137 years. So the texts are very clear that Amram lived for a total of 137 years. Again, we're not told how old Kohath was when he entered Egypt with Jacob. We're not told how old Kohath was when Amram was born, and as far as I know, we're not told how old Amram was when Moses was born. So to be fair, we're going to look at the absolute maximum length of time that the Israelites could have been in Egypt given what we're told. If Kohath was born in the same year Jacob and Levi entered Egypt, and Kohath's son Amram was born in the very last year of Kohath's life, and if Moses was born in the very last year of Amram's life, then that would give us the absolute maximum number of years that the Israelites could have been in Egypt. And that absolute maximum is 350 years. But it's highly unlikely that Kohath was born in the same year they entered Egypt, and Amram born in the same year Kohath died, and Moses born in the same year Amram died. So the number of years the Israelites were in Egypt is most likely less than 350 years. So why then does Exodus 12 say in verse 40 that the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years, and at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, they all went out of Egypt? If the texts are clear that Jacob entered Egypt with Kohath, Kohath lived a total of 133 years, Kohath's son Amram lived a total of 137 years, and Amram's son Moses took the Israelites out of Egypt when he was 80 years old, then the number of years in Egypt could not have been more than 350 years. Therefore, 430 years in Egypt is not possible, and that's not what Exodus 12 says. It says the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So verse 40 is talking about the sojourning itself. Second, the phrase children of Israel at first glance seems to refer only to the descendants of Jacob. However, when we look at the meaning of this word that was translated as children, number 1121, we can see that this word also means member of a group or the people of a nation. So it's not just referring to the descendants of Jacob, it's referring to the people of the nation of Israel. Also notice this word means first. So it's referring not just to the people of the nation of Israel, but specifically to the first people of the nation of Israel. So it's literally saying in Exodus 12 verse 40 that the sojourning of the first people of the nation of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So the first people of the nation of Israel sojourned for 430 years. Well, who was the very first person of the nation of Israel? Notice that when Yahweh spoke to the nation of Israel, Yahweh usually said to them, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even though technically the lineage goes all the way back to Adam, Abraham is and has always been considered the father of the nation of Israel. So when Exodus 12 mentions the sojourning of the first people of the nation of Israel, it's talking about the sojourning that started with Abraham, because Abraham was the first person of the nation of Israel. And Genesis 35 confirms that. In verse 21, it says, and Israel journeyed. Then verse 27 says, Jacob came unto Isaac his father in the town where, notice this, Abraham and Isaac sojourned. This makes it clear that Abraham and his son Isaac were sojourning before Jacob was. So in Exodus 12, it's telling us the sojourning of the first people of the nation of Israel, including Abraham and Isaac and all their descendants who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. And at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. That was Moses and the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, the first of the nation of Israel. So although it takes some digging, we do have solid biblical confirmation that the Israelites were physically in Egypt less than 350 years. And when we consider that the sojourning of 430 years started with Abraham, the timeline is complete. We're told Abraham left when he was 75 years old, and that was the start of the sojourning. The word sojourn literally means a temporary stay or live temporarily. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the word sojourn is a period of time when you stay in a place as a traveler or guest. So in modern times, instead of saying that a person is sojourning or staying in temporary places, we would say they are traveling. For the first people of the nation of Israel, that traveling started when Abraham left his home to go to Canaan. That's what Exodus 12 says. The traveling or the sojourning of the first people of the nation of Israel was 430 years. And at the end of that 430 years, they left Egypt. In addition, it's clear that there were 215 years between the year Abraham left his home until the year Jacob entered Egypt. And when we consider that the sojourning started with Abraham, that leaves 215 15 years that the Israelites spent physically living in Egypt, for a total of 430 years of traveling for the first people of the nation of Israel. So the total number of years between Abraham and David is clear. There were exactly 941 years from Abraham's birth until David was crowned as king of Israel. This is very important because in the book of Matthew, in the very first chapter, we're told this time period between Abraham and David represents 14 generations. And later in the same book, we're told one generation will not pass after the budding of the fig tree Israel. When the fig tree Israel sprouts forth leaves in the spring, one generation will not pass before everything mentioned in chapter 24 is fulfilled. As we said before, there's more than one possible meaning for this. Either the budding of the fig tree in the spring represents the creation of the country of Israel in 1948, or it doesn't. But if it does, there are at least 4 options concerning how long exactly that one generation is. It's either the actual length of time that the people born in 1948 will live, which would end sometime in 2071, or it's 70 or 80 years, as the book of Psalms indicates, which would end either before 2018 or before 2028, or it's the exact period of time laid out in the first chapter of the book of Matthew itself. If you were reading a book written by an author and you didn't quite understand the meaning of something in that book, would you rely on that book itself to explain the meaning, or would you go to a different book by a different author to explain the meaning? The riddle about the last generation is in the book of Matthew, and the book of Matthew itself tells us straight away, the first thing it mentions is the exact length of one generation. It gives us 3 time periods, each representing 14 generations. With just a tiny bit of math, that gives us 4 possible lengths of one generation. And the first length is the maximum. Exactly 941 years between Abraham and David, divided by 14 generations, gives us exactly 67.21 years in one generation. The second time period gives us a generation of 32.42 years. The third time period gives us a generation of 42.85 years. And if we count all the years together and divide by 14 times 3, or 42 generations, we get one generation of 47.5 years. Matthew 1 only lists 41 people here. So the total of 42 generations clearly does not refer to the people themselves. Instead, it seems to refer to the exact number of years. The parable of the fig tree is a riddle that requires some thought. But right after telling us this riddle, Jesus warned not to count the days or the hours, even though that is possible once you understand the meaning. He said, you cannot know the day or the hour, but instead, his words, in other words, his parables, will be fulfilled in their season. That includes his words about the fig tree. In the book of Matthew, he said, once the fig tree puts forth leaves in the spring, this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. That generation is a maximum of 67.21 years in the book of Matthew itself. That's the maximum. If the creation of the country of Israel in the spring of 1948 was the sprouting of the leaves, then we are literally right now in the season which represents the end of the fig tree generation. 67.21 years, calculating only weeks and months, ended in mid-September, which was the start of the fall season. So it was not September 7th that represented the end of the generation, because Jesus said, don't count the days. And it wasn't the month of September alone that represented the end of that generation, because Jesus said it will be fulfilled in a season. So not mid-September itself, but the season that starts in mid-September. It is the entire fall season of 2015 that represents the end of one generation, according to the book of Matthew, from the year the fig tree Israel was declared a nation in the spring of 1948. If this were the only thing pointing to the fall of 2015, then maybe we could brush it off. But this is not the only complex Bible prophecy that is pointing to the time period we're in now. I'm sure you will agree that in the Matthew 24 timeline, the stars fall immediately after the tribulation of the days. And when the stars fall after the tribulation of the days, the elect will be gathered together. One will be taken and the other left. But before the tribulation of the days can start, the abomination of desolation has to stand in the holy place. We're told in the Matthew 24 timeline that in order to understand what the abomination of desolation is, we must understand the prophecies of Daniel. Daniel 12 is clear that the abomination of desolation will be set up after a 1290-day period that starts at the ceasing of the sacrifice. We're also told days in the Bible can represent years. So it's saying a 1290-day or year period must precede the abomination of desolation. In addition to that, we're told in Daniel 11 that the abomination of desolation will occur according to a timeline of very specific events that started in the year Darius was king. This made it clear that the abomination of desolation was the Dome of the Rock set up on the Jerusalem Temple Mount in 685 CE. At that time, Jesus said, those in Judea will flee into the mountains. In Revelation 12, we're told the woman fled into the wilderness for 1260 days. So this tribulation of the days is specifically 1260 days. Days can represent years, so this is specifically 1260 days or years that occur before the stars fall and the elect are taken. But the book of Revelation adds something else. Before the woman flees into the wilderness, a very specific celestial configuration occurs in the sky, and it was the exact configuration that occurred in 686 during the building of the Dome of the Rock. The 1260 years have been speculated about for centuries, but in 1825, Bible scholar Adam Clarke wrote that the 1260-year period started in either 754, 755, or 756, and would end, therefore, in either 2014, 2015, or 2016. And by the way, I'm not Seventh-day Adventist. I don't belong to any religion. I'm doing this research independently. There are many commencement dates speculated about, but this one fits so perfectly it almost seems contrived. 755 was exactly 70 years after 685 when the abomination of desolation was set up, and 1260 years after 755 is 2015. Jeremiah tells us the fall of Babylon will occur after a 70-year period of serving Babylon. And it was not what occurred in ancient times, because in Daniel 9, Daniel said, hey, what's going on? Why didn't the 70 years end? Okay, so that 70 years in Jeremiah did not refer to something that happened in ancient times. It's talking about the future. It's talking about when Babylon covers the whole earth. Please look at Jeremiah 25. Now notice this. 1260 years after 685 lands in 1945, the very year of the rise of the king of fierce countenance, which is the healed seventh head of the beast, also known as the eighth king. We're told the eighth king is the beast with 7 heads, and Babylon sits on that beast. In other words, Babylon sits on the 8th king. The 8th king rose to power in 1945. It's the king of fierce countenance who devours the whole earth and destroys by peace. Babylon sits, in other words, on the UN. Jeremiah tells us the nations of the world will serve Babylon for 70 years. The 8th king, whom Babylon sits on, rose to power in the fall of 1945. The fall of 2015 is exactly 70 years from the rise of the 8th king, and in 2015, the 8th king of the 8th king is ruling, the 8th Secretary General. So we have both the 1260-year period ending in 2015 and a significant 70-year period ending in 2015. Please notice you can't just pull these out of a hat. It has to match the timeline exactly, and it does. There's so much more to this that I cannot list it in this video because it would take hours and hours, but it is presented in detail in the playlist Bible's Countdown to the Meteorite and Rescue that is linked below. And please, I'm begging you to look at that playlist yourself or tell your pastor or anyone you think understands Bible prophecy to prove this wrong using scripture. Even Daniel 9 has been fulfilling in the past 70 years. It looks like we just entered the 7th year of Daniel's final week in October of this year, and I present the evidence for that as well in the playlist below. So that's it for now. Thank you so much to those who support this work. I will talk to you next week.